Hello again. We're into more about what's going on in whole muscles in terms of movements rather than just individual muscle cells within a muscle. Now we are going to go back to the cell level a little bit later because we're going to talk about energy that's required for muscle contraction, and then we're also going to talk about different types of muscle fibers that you have within individual skeletal muscles. So the next topic here will be about muscle mechanics, and there'll be some new terminology in here for us. All right, so as we go through the next few lectures, keep in mind, we've been talking so far about contraction within individual muscle cells, muscle fibers, but a lot of the same principles apply across a whole muscle, because a whole muscle, of course, is going to be divided up into, if you got a whole muscle here, it's going to be divided up into many microscopic individual muscle fibers. So hundreds of thousands to millions, if not more, muscle fibers make up a whole skeletal muscle. Would be interesting to find out the exact numbers. All right, so contractions, the muscle contractions that take place as those individual muscle cells are contracting because of the cross bridging that's going on in all of their sarcomeres and their myofibrils. As those contractions occur in the individual muscle fibers, that's going to produce tension within the muscle, and the tension is the amount of force that you are exerting on a load or an object that you're trying to move. So if you're using muscles that push, like your triceps muscles on the posterior side of the upper arm, as your triceps brachii muscles contract, the tension that they're generating is generating a force that you're using to push against something. Or let's say you were holding a dumbbell in your hand, your biceps brachii muscle in your upper arm contracts, and it's generating a force, which if that force is greater than the load that you're handling, then you're going to flex your elbow joint. You're going to be able to move that dumbbell up closer towards your upper arm. All right, so as you guys know, your skeletal muscles are capable of generating different levels of force, can contract for different durations, and some of that gets into things that vary from individual to individual, or vary according to gender, vary according to the how frequently you use your muscles, whether you exercise them, whether they're used to carrying or exerting, undergoing exertion. Stimuli. So the stimulus is going to be the action potentials that are coming in from the motor neuron. So those action potentials from the motor neuron can occur with different frequencies. So, they may be spaced a little further apart, or those action potentials may come one right after the other, right after the other, right after the other. And then also you can have stimuli of different intensities. You can have stronger stimuli and weaker stimuli. And much of that actually gets into the brain and the control over those motor neurons. It's easy. Some motor neurons, as we'll see as we move through these lectures, respond to less stimuli or lower amounts of stimuli, and then other motor neurons require a whole lot more stimulation from the brain before they're actually going to tell their muscle fibers, hey, you guys need to contract. And so that's how the brain is able to very smoothly and in a very precise way control the amount of force that you generate in your muscles. Imagine if you couldn't do that. We would be very uncoordinated if that wasn't able to happen. Okay, so some terminology here about muscle contractions. Now here we're thinking about a whole muscle, not individual muscle fibers, so whole muscle. Okay, muscle contractions do not always shorten a muscle. So we're used to thinking, okay, well, the muscle's contracting. Well, the muscle itself is getting shorter. That's kind of the vision that we have, but that doesn't always happen. Okay, so you can have within the muscle fibers in a muscle, cross-bridging taking place, and those actin and myosins may be sliding across each other, but the muscle itself, the organ itself, muscles are an organ, may stay the same size, or they may actually lengthen during a contraction, or they may do the thing more typical of what we think about, which is shortening. Okay, so a contraction, you may have heard of isometric exercises before. Isometric contractions are where you have cross-bridging within the muscle fiber, so the muscle is actually contracting, but the muscle itself is remaining the same size. It's not shortening and it's not stretching out. Remember, muscles are elastic. They can be stretched, and then they can also rebound. So an isometric type contraction is one in which the muscle is staying the same size even though it's contracting. Okay, so imagine if you had a heavy dumbbell sitting in your fist, and you're generating, it's really, really heavy, you're generating as much force as you possibly can, and it's just staying stationary. Okay, so your elbow is not flexing, your elbow is not extending, it's just staying in place, and you can't really move it. That's called an isometric contraction, because the muscle itself, that biceps brachii muscle, and the others that assist the biceps brachii are staying the same size. Okay, and then there are muscle contractions called isotonic contractions, where the muscle shortens because the muscle tension exceeds the load. Okay, I'm going to have to make you guys aware of something, though. There are some differences in this terminology that you'll notice if you do some reading on it. Because isotonic contractions, so here we're defining isotonic contractions as one in which the muscle shortens because the tension that the muscle is generating exceeds the load. So if you are holding a dumbbell in your fist and you're generating tension in your biceps brachii muscle that exceeds that load, you're going to be able to bring the dumbbell closer to your upper arm. You're going to have flexion at the elbow joint. However, isotonic contractions can also be divided up into what are called concentric contractions and eccentric contractions. And concentric contractions are essentially what I just described. Eccentric contractions, though, you have tension in the muscle, but the muscle is actually stretching out. It's actually lengthening, and so we'll see more of that here on the next couple of slides. All right, so that should have sounded a little bit contradictory, and I find information from different sources being contradictory with this, because some sources are going to tell you that isotonic contractions, the muscle shortens. Others are going to tell you that with an isotonic contraction, that just means that the muscle is changing in length. It's either getting shorter or longer as it moves the load. So I think what we're going to do is we're not going to worry too much about isotonic contractions, since that phrase seems to be confused from different sources. But let's do know these two, concentric versus eccentric. And then I also want you to know isometric as well. So focus in on those three, isometric versus concentric and versus eccentric. And let's just take a look at the diagram on the next slide. We've already talked about what isometric contractions are, so you've got that written information in there. But let's move over here onto this one, because this is going to give you a visual of what I've been talking about. All right, so a concentric contraction is like if you're holding a dumbbell in your fist, there's your biceps brachii muscle. It's generating tension, and as you bring that dumbbell up, as your elbow flexes, the biceps brachii muscle itself is going to get shorter. That's a concentric contraction. An isometric contraction would occur if you had tension developed within the muscle, but you're just holding the dumbbell there in place. So the biceps brachii muscle itself is not getting shorter and it's not getting longer. An eccentric contraction is where you still have tension being generated in the muscle. You have cross bridging going on within muscle fibers, but the force that you're generating is lower than the load, than the force of your load. So in this case, the dumbbell is actually lowering. You're certainly still contracting the biceps brachii muscle, otherwise you would drop the dumbbell on the floor, but the muscle itself is actually stretching out. So you've still got cross bridging going on inside the muscle, but the other tissues of the muscle, which provide its elasticity and stretchability or extensibility, remember that term, extensibility. Skeletal muscles are extensible and also elastic, they'll rebound. And so that's what's going on with an eccentric contraction. And you'll hear those terms used in exercise physiology, or even if you just work out, you'll hear, when you work out with weights, you'll hear about, or sometimes you're recommended to use a certain amount of time for the concentric portion of the movement and a certain amount of time for the eccentric portion of the movement. To say take 2 or 3 seconds to do the concentric, where you raise a dumbbell upward as you flex your elbow, and then maybe just take 1 second on the eccentric as you lower the dumbbell down. That would be the eccentric portion of the motion, of the movement. So whenever the muscle itself is contracting and shortening, that's the concentric phase. Whenever it's lengthening, that's the eccentric phase. So those are the 3 terms there that you need to know. That tonic, that suffix of isotonic, the tonic here, you know, before we've heard that with tonicity, with solute concentrations in your body fluids, and here it's actually referring to tone in the muscle. And so what do we mean by muscle tone? So your muscles have a constant, slightly contracted state. So otherwise you would just be a big blob of jelly if your muscles were not at least slightly contracting at all times. So at all times you've got some of the motor neurons that control a muscle are sending signals and telling muscle fibers to do some cross bridging to help those muscles maintain their tone. That's called muscle tone. And that gets into, there are spinal reflexes, which you'll learn about more about spinal reflexes in Unit 5. Spinal reflexes, that means the brain really doesn't even have to get involved in the controlling processes. The control of this actually occurs directly through the spinal cord. And so we'll see some examples of that when we get into Unit 5. Your knee-jerk reflex is an example of one of those, you know, where you go to the doctor and he hits you on the knee with a hammer, he's checking your reflexes. Well, it turns out the reason that happens is because that's a reflection of spinal reflexes helping you maintain tone in your leg muscles so that you can remain standing. You don't just collapse down onto the ground due to gravity. So we're going to learn more about that when we get into Unit 5. So your skeletal muscles all have at least some tone. So that's where the tonic part or tonic part came from, isotonic. And that helps keep your muscles firm and healthy and also ready to respond. They're ready to contract. Different muscles have different amounts of tone, and tone here is not referring to, hey, I'm going to work out so my muscles will get tone and I'll look good in a swimsuit. That's not what we're referring to here. It's not quite the same thing. But you have different amounts of tone in different muscles. For example, the flexor, the flexor digitorum muscles in your forearm that allow you to flex your fingers, for example. Or think about it, if you just hold your hand like this, how are your fingers curved? Your fingers tend to be a little more curved inward. They're not flat. They're more curved inward. And one of the reasons for that is because you have increased muscle tone in your flexor digitorum muscles over here on the anterior side of your forearm versus over here on the posterior side of your forearm where you have your extensor digitorum muscles, the ones that allow you to extend your fingers outward. So these muscles tend to have less tone when they're being relaxed, whereas your flexor digitorum muscles have more tone, and that's one of the reasons why your fingers tend to have some curl to them. Okay, so that was a little bit on some terminology with muscle mechanics. For the next lecture, we're going to talk more about motor units. Motor units gets into, well, how do we control the force of contraction within a muscle? What's going on there? So we'll learn about that in the 13th lecture for Chapter 9.